بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. To proceed, brothers and sisters and friends and everybody else, I greet you with the warmest Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Which basically means, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. Brothers and sisters and friends, thank you very much for attending today's lecture, which I think is a very important lecture for us to start thinking about our ethical lives and the foundation concerning our moral outlook. But before I get into that, I want to try and melt the ice. Many of us, when we have conversations with one another, we like to pre-frame each other. I see some faces in this room, they may not be Muslim, they may be agnostic, atheist. To be honest, these categories and labels are unnecessary, especially when it comes to discourse. And let me explain why. Because I think the problem in when we try to engage with each other's ideas is the problem of categorization, and it is the problem of pre-framing each other. And this is why I think we should follow what I would like to call a Quranic ethic when engaging with one another. Interestingly, in the Quran, in the 2nd chapter, God, He announces that He's going to send down a man on earth as a vicegerent to take care of the planet. And the angels, they say, essentially, hold on a second. You're going to bring someone down that's going to create bloodshed and misery and war. And God says, I know that which you don't know. Now, when we ponder upon these verses and we don't just become desert romantics and sit back on the deck chair, touch the sand, look at the stars and write poetry to our beloved. But rather, if we scratch the surface, we see that essentially we should not use our previous experiences, our baggage, our limited perceptions, and pre-frame that onto new realities. Because, for example, I could do this test in this room and say to the Muslims, when you think of the word atheist, what comes to mind? Now, I've done this many times, and what many Muslims say, which is unfortunate, arrogant, pseudo-scientific, they think they know the truth, lost, deluded. And I've also done this with atheists. And what have the atheists said? Unfortunately, backward, extremist, terrorist, unnuanced, blind faith. So you see, both camps are pre-framing each other. And this is the biggest problem. We've pre-framed each other. And that's why we can't connect with one another. So the cliches concerning the atheists are obviously wrong. And the cliches concerning the Muslims is also wrong. But we don't get it. You know why? Because we're carrying this baggage. We're carrying this limited experience, these limited perceptions, and we're imposing it on these new realities. Even when you look at me, I'm not saying I'm popular, but maybe you've seen my debate with Professor Lawrence Krauss. Famous atheist, Hamza Tzortzis, has a debate with him. I come across in a certain way, I agree. At times I come across arrogant, at times humble, at other times a little bit confused. There's a whole myriad of emotional dispositions coming out. So I don't blame you if that's the only thing you saw and you came to this room and said, right, I'm going to get this guy. And that's why I really want to focus on this psychological element in the beginning, because it allows us now to listen to the words and the meaning that they represent and not the personality or the emotions or our previous narrative. Imagine all human beings did this. We will all fall in love, right? So I think it's very important for us to connect that way. Insha'Allah, which means God willing. So today's topic, brothers and sisters, is if good and evil exist, then God must exist. And this is the summary of today's argument. If what we mean by good and what we mean by evil, if we mean those things in an objective sense, then God must exist. Let me give you an example of what we mean by objective. Imagine I had my 6-year-old son here, Zachariah, and all of a sudden, I pulled out my AK-47 and I shot him in the head. And I went, I think everybody, intuitively and within ourselves, even if we sideline our emotions, we would say that is not only immoral and evil, but it is objectively immoral and evil. Regardless if the whole room had a consensus and said, no, actually, according to his beliefs, according to his upbringing and his culture, it could be morally okay. I don't think anyone in this room is prepared to say such a thing. So we have this sense of ought within us, inbuilt, that we know some things are grey. Other things, there's no compromise. This is objectively, morally wrong, regardless if the whole of Cardiff, the whole of the UK, the whole of the world, or the whole of the universe came together and said, no, it is actually a good thing to do. You would still stand and say, no, it is an objectively, morally wrong thing to do. This is objective evil. My argument today is, if that's true, if we start with this axiom, which means a self-evident truth, and we build upon that premise, then God indeed exists. And I'm going to explain this. But I want to really be nuanced here and tell you what we are not saying. Number one, we are not saying the following: you can't be an atheist and display moral or good behavior. That's ridiculous. Some of the nicest people I've met are atheists. Like Professor Richard Norman. Had a discussion with him a few years ago. Great guy. You could have a pint of milk with him any day. Just to make it Islamic, because we don't drink. The second thing we are not saying, you have to believe in God to have moral traits, such as defending the innocent and feeding the poor. Of course not. Many atheists work for volunteer organizations. Many are activists, especially for liberal movements that want equality and rights and human rights for many countries. So they have their sense of what they think is right. Number three, we are not saying just by being a believer, you will have good behavior. You know this, Muslims, right? It's in our families, in our homes. We have issues. We're human beings. Nobody's perfect. So we're not saying these things in this argument. This is what we are saying. Number one, if God doesn't exist, then you can never say objectively that killing my innocent 6-year-old is morally wrong. Because moral values such as murdering innocent people for entertainment is wrong and defending the innocent is good will be just mere social conventions. Like, is it okay to pick your nose at the dinner table or to burp loudly? Why? People are thinking now, but why is that the case? Why is it the case that in order for me to assert that killing an innocent 6-year-old is objectively morally wrong, why is it the case for me to assert this, then God must exist? Why? Because brothers and sisters and friends, without God there is no foundation for objective moral values. Why? Because think about the concept of God, of the divine reality. The concept is that you can't really attribute subjectivity to this concept because God transcends human subjectivity by definition. He is the only kind of conceptual anchor point that transcends human relative and subjective perspectives. Now you may think, but there are other possible foundations for morality. And in moral philosophy, this is called moral ontology. You don't have to know that term, but just to spice up the language a bit, it's moral ontology, the foundations, the grounding for our moral outlook. Now you may think there are other possible sources for morality. Number one, biology. Number two, social pressure. Number three, social realism. And we're going to discuss what these mean. Sorry, moral realism. And we're going to discuss what these mean. Now, what's an interesting atheist position, before we get into the other alternatives, is that some academic atheists have said, you know what? It's true. If you remove the divine out of the picture, we can never assert, according to our framework, our model, our worldview, our atheistic philosophy, if one exists. You can never assert that there are objective moral values, or that's objectively evil, or that's objectively good. You can never assert this. Some academic atheists have asserted such viewpoint. They said it's just all relative. For example, the late Professor J.O. Mackie, in his book Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, he says the following on page 15, and it was published by Penguin. He says, there are no objective values. The claim that values are not objective, are not part of the fabric of the world, is meant to include not only moral goodness, which might be most naturally equated with moral value, but also other things that could be more loosely called moral values or disvalues, rightness, wrong and wrongness, duty, obligation, and actions being rotten and contemptible, and so on. So essentially, J.O. Mackie is saying we can't really establish an ontological basis, a foundation to ground our morals so we could assert that they are objective. And that's what he felt concerning the atheistic position. And it is no wonder Professor Ian Markham explained in his book Against Atheism, God explains